Welcome to Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane, brought to you by the Washington Speakers Bureau. In this space, we will explore some of the most pressing challenges that leaders face today with the world's most respected, innovative, curious, and accomplished thought leaders. We'd like to welcome our host, best-selling author and co-author of the recently published book, Choose Love, Not Fear, a WSB exclusive speaker for almost 30 years, Gary Heil.
This is Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane. I'm Gary Heil. Today's guest needs absolutely no introduction. Arianna Huffington is a visionary and is one of the most influential leaders on the planet. As the founder of the Huffington Post, she challenged us to rethink our thinking about how we produce and consume media. And now, as the founder and CEO of Thrive Global, she's challenging us to rethink how we define success in our lives. She's the best-selling author of 15 books. Her last two, The Sleep Revolution and Thrive, were international bestsellers on the day they were published. Arianna, welcome and happy belated birthday.
Thank you so much, Gary. Great to be with you.
When I first read Thrive, I was just sure you were talking to me. I was feeling your hands coming right through the book. To me, you were saying, get off autopilot and be more mindful of the decisions you make that define your success. Now, I know we don't like to think we live as a member of the herd, and we're, but we are sometimes. And am I getting the message you had right? I mean, I was like, be mindful, get off autopilot.
Absolutely, Gary. I feel that most of us, especially people who are type A, driven, high achievers, have bought into a collective delusion that in order to succeed, we have to be on autopilot, we have to be always on, we have to power through while we're exhausted. And that's not surprising. Our culture believes that. And so we're swimming in that cultural water, and we need to be very deliberate and intentional about changing. Even though, we have all the data and the science that shows that, in fact, our performance improves, our productivity improves when we take time to recharge. We are still in the process of changing the culture and changing it at the company level, changing it at the community level and at the individual level.
Yeah, but it's hard. Changing culture or even being in the culture and bucking it is hard, right? I noticed you read this week in anticipation of your birthday, you wrote that looking back through your notes that you realized pretty early in life what was important, and you also realized later on in life how bad you were at changing relative to what you knew. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely, Gary. In fact, this gap between awareness and action is really what I'm most interested in right now. Frankly, I left the Huffington Post in 2016 to launch Thrive Global because I wanted to go beyond raising awareness, which I could have kept doing through the Huffington Post, through a media company. But I wanted to help people change behaviors, which is where the action part comes. And that's really what Thrive and I are consumed with right now. And it's become even more important during the pandemic because we've seen how all the different crises that we left unaddressed, the mental health crisis, the skyrocketing increase in chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, have made us much more vulnerable to the pandemic.
Yeah, and I noticed in your one of the studies that you cited, they said that Harvard medical studies show that 96% of leaders thought they were suffering from burnout. 96% of them thought, yet they still can't change.
Yes, well, here's what was so interesting. I had a webinar with the Accenture leadership team, the global management team that runs Accenture. They had all the leaders there from all around the world. And what was so interesting, and Ellen Shook, their CHRO, speaks about it, so I'm not disclosing any great secrets. What was interesting was that a lot of these leaders who run a company that has 500,000 employees across the globe believed that if they did something for themselves, it would be self-indulgent, that their people needed them, that this was a moment of crisis. Of course, they all feel like that at all times, but especially during a moment like that. And then what was fascinating is that when we started talking about how can we change our mindset, which is the first step, how can we introduce small micro steps every day that help us recharge without being huge time suckers. That's what people have to realize. They can see the impact. And Ellen Shook herself, the CHRO, has spoken about the fact that from that day on, she introduced a daily walk. And she's now up at day 140, and she hasn't missed one walk. And how that began the process of her feeling more present, more recharged, making better decisions. You know, it's not like a big thing. We're not saying leave your job, go to the Caribbean, even if you could fly. It's more what is important to you, so that you are more recharged, more creative, more able to make the best decisions you can as a leader.
And that's the way culture changes, right, Arianna? It changes one person and one habit at a time. It rarely changes by some just big program. It happens when we take those micro steps and one behavior, one person at a time, but it takes courage, right?
Well, I think actually it takes being willing to look at the data. You know, I don't think you need courage, because we claim to be data driven. And yet we're ignoring the data when it comes to our own behavior and the connection between our ability to recharge and be the best leader we can be and what we need to do ourselves every day to get to that place.
I love your phrasing about that, though. I love it when you say, put your own mask on first. Now, today that's got a special meaning beyond, I think, when you first wrote it. But the idea that I have to change myself before I can change the way I influence others is a really critical first step, right, as it applies to leaders?
Absolutely. And even if we start with the assumption that every leader has a great sense of responsibility, they want to be the best leader they can be. Seeing the connection between exhaustion and decision-making is key. And one of the things we do at Thrive, as well as offering all these micro steps through our behavior change app, we offer role models. You know, storytelling is very important in changing behavior. So if you're a business leader and you are questioning whether you can afford to take any time for yourself, I would suggest you read about Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos wrote on Thrive why he gets 8 hours of sleep, because specifically he said it improves his decision making. Now, there will be nights when you can't get the amount of sleep you need. And that's less important than what we do chronically and every day. And that's where the data is so clear. As you know, Gary, I wrote an entire book on sleep. And the data is so unequivocal, unless you have a genetic mutation. And maybe some people watching us have a genetic mutation and they don't need a lot of sleep. 1 to 1.5% of the population has that mutation. People can test themselves, or they can simply look at how they feel after 4 hours sleep. But the rest of us need 7 to 9 hours to be fully recharged, ready to go. You know that feeling you have when you wake up and it's like, bring it on, world. Whatever the challenge today, I can handle it. And isn't that an amazing feeling, an amazing place from which to lead?
And the science, I was blown away by the science you note about sleep. It's overwhelming, isn't it? It's just incontrovertible.
It's incontrovertible. And it's both about our physical health and our mental acuity, because sleep is the only time when our brain can get rid of the toxins that accumulate during the day.
And you know, when we think about ourselves as leaders and we come and we're a little off, we're not our best, or rarely do we think about just wonder or sleep or those kind of things. We're often missing the point a little bit, right? If leadership is not a list of techniques, but a reflection of who you are, when you bring your best self to work, you may not be a great leader, but you've got a leg up in being a much better leader, don't you?
Absolutely. And it's a function of decision making. It's also a function of empathy. As we are increasingly engaged in improving diversity, belonging, inclusion within companies, we know that empathetic leaders and managers have a much better chance at achieving that. And yet, Gary, as you know, empathy, creativity, and resilience are the first to go when we are running on empty.
And boy, without them, it's really hard to lead very effectively. But you know, it's sort of the point is to look inward first. There's so many leadership things that are going around teaching you how to be a leader this way, or to adopt this kind of situational principle, or to act this way. But to look in the mirror and go inward first, I think is your term. I think it makes great sense, right? But not what we want to do.
Exactly, because sometimes it's easier to look at what we want to fix outside ourselves, and absolutely that's an essential part of leadership as well. At Thrive, our motto is onward, upward, and inward. Obviously onward and upward. You know, you wouldn't be a leader if you were not high achieving and ambitious and willing to climb every mountain. But inward is also incredibly important. And we have a lot of great leaders. I'm going to mention my favorite, who demonstrated that. And that's Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor of Rome for 19 years, 14 years of which he had to deal with a terrible plague. And I use that example whenever I'm talking to a leader who says to me, Arianna, you know, I can't do that. I have a very big job. And I say, well, you know, so did Marcus Aurelius. He was emperor of Rome. And every night he would go to bed and write what became his book, Meditations, which I believe is a great leadership book. Mm-hmm. Because basically it was how he could connect with what he called his inner citadel. You know, that place in himself from which he could operate from a place of calm, strength, and resilience. And I call it the eye in the hurricane. I love this image of the eye in the hurricane. In fact, I have an actual hurricane with the eye on my desk, because right now leaders are living in a hurricane of incredible uncertainty and incredible trials for every company, even the ones that are doing well at this time. Uncertainty is one of the things businesses always try to avoid. So knowing that there is an eye in this hurricane and you can operate from that is so incredibly powerful, and it affects everything and everybody.
It's a time when we look in the mirror and everything's changing, and the new normal is a lot more new and a lot less normal. And it may be the time when we need this advice the most, when it's probably the hardest to take it, the hardest to accept it, and the hardest to change is when you're overwhelmed, but it's when we need it the most, right?
Yes, but I also believe that it's times like that that are catalysts for change. Because as you know, change is always very hard and there is a lot of inertia against change. But at a time of crisis like that, which is a time of discontinuities, a time when everything changes and everything is challenged, there is an opportunity to see it as a portal for creating a new world. And looking back and seeing, what do we need to change? What really wasn't working before? And I think the way you started our conversation is the primary thing that was not working before. It's people living breathlessly, frenetically, without a clear prioritization in their lives, or making a distinction between the urgent and the important. And now, despite all the difficulties of these times, and Gary, I'm not underestimating them in any way, we have an opportunity to reflect, to look back and to look forward and seeing the new world we want to create in our company, in our lives, in the world. What are the new elements we want to bring to it?
Yeah, let's take that for a second in looking forward. And you have been an advocate, maybe channeling your inner Viktor Frankl before most of us. I noticed when I went back and looked, it might have been like 1994 when you wrote The Fourth Instinct. And I'm reading the beginning of it.
A lot of research.
And you're talking about a sense of purpose. And I'd like to know what your thoughts are. When I have a sense of purpose and I feel like what I'm doing is making a huge difference in the world, I somehow feel less burned out. I somehow feel less like I'm on a treadmill. And it gives my life meaning in ways that if I don't have that, and I'm wondering if you feel as I do, that some of the treadmill we're on, there's more treadmill and less purpose in a lot of jobs.
I completely agree with you about the importance of purpose and feeling really identified with what you're doing. I mean, I feel that so much right now. You know, I feel my work is what I love. So there is no sense of why am I doing that? Should I be on a beach somewhere instead? That sounds awful, even if I could be on a beach, except maybe for a few days to recharge. But I think also having a sense of purpose and being very committed and driven by whatever it is we're doing can become its own trap if we don't recognize that avoiding burnout is also very important when we have a deep sense of purpose. We've seen that at Thrive with our work with nonprofit leaders who are so incredibly committed to what they're doing. And if your job is to end hunger or poverty or malaria, then you fall into the trap of thinking, yes, but if I go to sleep, more people will die. And that's where you need to realize that, in fact, you're going to make better decisions. And you're going to be more productive and effective if you take care of yourself first, if you put your own oxygen mask on first. So that's, again, requires a mindset shift and also the recognition that these micro steps, we call them too small to fail. Like they're not big seismic changes in your life. They're little things every day. Like, let me give you a couple of my favorite micro steps so people realize that the level of change we are asking people to start with is very manageable and doable. Like we recommend as one of the first micro steps to take 1 minute in the morning, 60 seconds before you go to your phone. You know, over 70% of people go to their phone first thing before they're fully awake, before their feet have touched the ground. And the problem with that is that then suddenly your day starts with what the world wants from you, not with what you want to achieve this day. And I mean, every leader needs to have a very clear set of their priorities and their intention. Otherwise, they're going to be overwhelmed by everybody's demands on them. And when I say 60 seconds, I literally mean 60 seconds to remember what are your 3 priorities today, or to remember what you're grateful for if you want to start the day in a positive and optimistic outlook, or to simply consciously inhale and exhale and not kind of immediately be confronted with something maybe in your inbox that gets your cortisol levels up, your stress levels up, even before you're fully ready to deal with these challenges. And Gary, let me just say one more thing. When I say 60 seconds, I didn't just make that up. Everything we are saying is based on science. So it's not like I picked randomly 60 seconds. It takes 60 to 90 seconds. Let's start with 60 to basically get centered if you're already stressed, to allow the cortisol hormone to leave your body. And everything else happens in our heads. So if we can have that beginning to the day and then these micro breaks during the day, you know, maybe instead of going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, taking like 60 seconds to reconnect with yourself and your purpose and what matters to you, isn't that worth it?
Boy, it sure would be. And it'd be really different. I mean, you talk a lot about partial attention. And we live in a world of partial attention. It seems like it's hard to have a conversation without somebody looking at their phone as if it was their lifeblood. And being more mindful about how we do divide our attention has got to be a challenge for many, but so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And particularly important now, because of course, we are all slightly addicted to our phones. Maybe slightly, maybe very, but there is nobody who is not addicted. So we need to create our own boundaries. First of all, we need to look at the data again and the science that makes it clear that multitasking doesn't really exist if you are doing 2 cognitive tasks. I mean, I love multitasking if I'm doing something that doesn't involve my mind, like if I'm washing the dishes or washing my hands or walking. But multitasking, if I'm having a conversation with you and I'm looking at my phone, both things will suffer. I won't really have a conversation with you that can get us anywhere. And I will miss important things maybe on my phone. So that's the first step. And the other step is, again, to establish some micro steps that help us deal better with our phones. I mean, one of our favorite micro steps is to pick a time at the end of the day when you stop consuming coronavirus news. So many people we're working with in so many companies can't stop consuming news and social media. And it's so much harder for them to be able to unwind, disconnect from the day, and have a good restorative sleep.
Guilty.
Well, it's like, I get it. We all want to be fully informed up to the minute. And in fact, with a lot of the leaders we're working with who are operating on multiple time zones, have a lot of responsibilities, our recommendations are, first of all, get an old-fashioned phone with no data. Do you remember those?
I do.
A phone that just rings if you're needed, and give it to the people who may need to reach you at all times. So you're fine. If anybody needs you, they can reach you. They should. But you don't sleep with your phone, because that means that at any time in the night, if you wake up, you're going to look at your phone, no matter if you tell yourself, I'm not. Yes, you are. And the minute you look at your phone, something there is going to re-engage your brain. And then it's so much harder to go to sleep in a deep way. So that's one solution. Get that old-fashioned phone that many many of the people who are younger than you and me, Gary, maybe have never seen or never bought for sure. And the other thing is to take turns. That's where team building comes in. Yes, maybe somebody from your team needs to be on 24/7, but it can't be the same people all the time. You can take turns, which is also a great way to learn to delegate as a leader and to build teams properly.
Yeah, you can't do everything all day or it just doesn't work, right? I love the phone idea. A couple of leadership words that I love the way you use. One of them, compassionate directness, I thought was a really interesting word.
Thank you so much. So compassionate directness is actually our #1 cultural value at Thrive. And the reason for that is that if people cannot be direct with each other, not in an adversarial way, but with compassion, there is no way you can create a thriving culture. Because in any relationship, whether it's professional or personal, things come up that we're not happy with. It's unavoidable. So if we don't express them, if we just sit on them, they're going to become resentment, they will fester, and they will affect everything. So there are certain things that, for example, we are very clear about. If you have a problem with someone you're working with and you go and tell a colleague, that colleague will encourage you to tell the person you're upset with directly. And if you're not comfortable doing that, to get the manager to mediate, to get HR to mediate. We're not talking about whistleblowing, we're not talking about some major infraction and problem that needs to be identified. We are talking about run-of-the-mill, everyday problems and frictions that arise. And it creates the sense of a company that's rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, and it's the compassion part of that is so critical, right? And the directness part, we have to see reality. We have to be able to tell each other the truth in a respectful, kind way. It's not this brutal thing that's going around where we're dissing each other in the name of I'm telling you how I feel.
Yes.
It's got to be better than that. I had a mentor a long time ago who told me that the first choice every leader needs to make is to choose to lead from love or choose to lead from fear, right? And he was telling me what I think you and I already know about most cultures is they're so fear-based, we don't even see them anymore. And your words I thought were pretty good when you, I think I'm quoting you, what you said, what we're really seeking in life and at work is connection and love. And there is just too little love in the environment, isn't there?
Yes, I love that in your book, Gary. That's such a great theme. And love may seem a word that's not relevant to business. And that's why we use compassion. If people are not comfortable with love, Microsteps start with compassion. But definitely get away from fear. Because operating from fear, and if you're a leader and you're operating from fear, your team is going to sense it. And if you expect them to do well out of fear, it's not sustainable. We are talking about leadership techniques and practices that create a sustainably healthy culture.
Yeah, and so many of the things we inherited as leadership practices from our forefathers used fear as an unintentional part of the culture, right? And so it's difficult. I found your words through this in Thrive. I found myself underlining like 2 pages, but I found a quote that you put in there from Francis de Sales, which I only wish I would have found earlier. I've never found a better quote, I think. And I'd love your comment on it. You said in your book, you learn to speak by speaking, study by studying, run by running, work by working. And if you want to learn to love, you learn to love by loving. And those are in your book. And I was like underlining it. And I said, I want to hang this on my wall. This is one of the best things I'd ever seen, because I think the only way we will learn to care deeply at work is by caring deeply. And do you feel, as I have, that many of the cultures we're in today sometimes move toward burnout or everything shareholder value, and we have forgotten the value of human beings many times, which help create this culture that supports burnout?
Absolutely. I love that you quoted this, because it's so true. It's really about building any skill or building character. It's all a matter of practice. And sometimes we forget that it doesn't happen overnight.
No, and I think that the scientist, as you say, the science is pretty good, that the more love in an environment, the more you need that love, and the more love begets more love. And fear just makes us stupid. And I don't know why we continue to do that.
And you know, Gary, it's particularly important at a time like now, when creativity and innovation are key. Maybe if we were just doing maintenance, you could just do it out of fear because everybody had the prescribed role, nothing was changing, and you could move on. It would be a suboptimal choice, but maybe it would be doable. But it definitely is a recipe for disaster if you are operating in times like this, when we don't know what next month will bring, when our decisions, our capacity to innovate and to create are absolutely critical. So I think it's important also to remember the times we're in and what might work, you know, in different times, simpler times, times when there weren't constant change and transitions would not work now.
No, and because fear puts us in this fight or flight or freeze kind of syndrome, which is what creates the cultures that you so aptly want to get away from, right? Maslow once said that one of the things about creativity is that when he found somebody who was creative, he said they were hopelessly lost in the present. And it seems to me that's exactly what you're writing about and saying, is that when I'm mindful, when I'm aware, when I'm in the present, when my attention's not distracted in 1,000 ways, I can be curious and more creative and more innovative. But he's saying the well-adjusted person has a better chance of focusing on those needs. You would agree, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. But that's a beautiful quote. That is so true. And of course, what we need to recognize that it's now harder than ever to actually be undistracted, to operate from a place where we are not constantly pushed in multiple directions.
It's like, it seems like every 5 minutes, and speed's the big deal. And creativity is a slow activity. And so your words, the art of slowing down is so critical for that, because a friend of mine used to say all the time, it's like I used to say all the time, that people drive me crazy when they were slow, until I realized that the only way to be creative was to be slow.
Yeah, and what is very important here is to recognize that doesn't mean not being ambitious, not having huge goals for yourself or your company. It's recognizing that when you take that time to be fully present and take that time to recharge, even if it takes 60 seconds, you're going to be much more effective at achieving your goals. And after all, we want people to work hard and to work smart. If working long hours has diminishing returns, what's the advantage of that? And let me make something else clear. We are not saying that this is a 9-to-5 culture. There's no 9-to-5 culture that's sustainable. At Thrive, for example, we make it very clear when we hire people that there may be times that you have to pull an all-nighter or work over the weekend to meet a deadline, to ship a product. But immediately afterwards, we have something that we call thrive time. Take the time you need, paid, to recharge and then return to work. And that has been amazing for our product and engineering culture, for example. I mean, we just shipped a product to Walmart. People had to work extra hard to meet our deadline. Now they are taking time off to recharge. Otherwise, what happens in most companies, you work extra hard and then you return to work, your immune system is suppressed. You're already tired, you're more likely to get sick, you're more likely to make bad decisions. So it's a vicious cycle. It doesn't really help the company, and it definitely doesn't help the employee.
No, and we need speed. Speed is a real advantage, but speed all the time doesn't allow for thinking time or sinking time or recovery time. I think that came across so loud and clear in Thrive's work that I'm like, okay, I'm looking in the mirror going, that's uncomfortable. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, after years of looking at leaders, I've come to the conclusion of something I'm probably unqualified to comment on. I believe that it probably is not just a coincidence that the countries most able to deal with the COVID virus are run by women, and that women leaders have a natural advantage over the rest of us. Do you share any of those feelings at all? I believe we may be equal, but we're not the same. And I think there's a natural advantage to being female when it comes to being a leader. Am I off on that?
I think in terms of traits, you know, there are traits that are found in both men and women, but which are identified by our culture as feminine, female traits like empathy, collaboration, ability to care for others and build teams, which are now more needed than ever. So having those traits, and women are more likely to have them than men, but it doesn't mean men don't have them. We know a lot of men who have them and are amazing leaders. But not having these traits now puts you at a disadvantage. I think that's what you're saying. And so
Yes,
to me, that's very important to recognize.
I also think it's a real natural advantage to have the diversity of more women in senior management, just for the way we think about things too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Women, race, all these things are now being recognized as so important at improving the bottom line. That's what is so great at the moment. There's no trade-off between prioritizing diversity and caring for the bottom line. In the same way, there is no trade-off between taking care of yourself and caring for business metrics. So
yeah, it's not. No, you're right. It's not an or, it's an and, right? We have to do both. You know, David Brooks said a while ago in one of his writings, he was comparing resume versus eulogy virtues. And you do a brilliant piece on that. It's probably one of the most confronting pieces to me in your work because it's so obvious yet so seldom thought of. And we don't think of some of the choices we make prospectively, but in retrospect, they're so obvious.
absolutely, you know, eulogy virtues versus our LinkedIn resume. And the truth is that if you've been to any memorial service, when we eulogize someone, have you ever heard anybody say, you know, George was amazing, he increased market share by 1/3? No, we always talk about the other values. And these are the values that make such a huge difference in our lives, and very often they are not prioritized. And again, that's not a trade-off.
No, not at all. And The other thing when we were talking about that, I thought one of the great analogies also was your roommate. I'm thinking about your imaginary roommate in your head.
Obnoxious roommate. Obnoxious roommate.
I have one just like it. Tell me.
Oh. So the obnoxious roommate is that voice of self-doubt, judgments. A lot of people who are perfectionists have it, because the truth is that we all make mistakes, and the important thing is learn from them and move on. I have a lot of sayings on my desk, and one of them is always make new mistakes. The problem is making the same mistake again and again. But people, I'm like that too, who have this rumination going on. And it's like having an obnoxious roommate in your head, judging you, criticizing you, doubting you, and it's exhausting, it's debilitating. So there are steps we can take. In fact, we just launched a program with Stanford Medicine called Thriving Mind. And Professor Leanne Williams, based on the latest brain research, has identified 8 different stress biotypes that, if left unaddressed, become anxiety and depression. One of them is rumination, which is what you and I have. And we give tools and techniques and microsteps to people to deal with their particular biotype of stress. Another one is threat response or negative bias. People who look at the world and imagine the worst. And that, of course, is very easy to do right now. So that's something else that we have some agency over, but it requires taking these small micro steps.
Yeah, and not letting that roommate be too big a part of our lives, right? You're talking about medicine. I was dealing with a medical group a while ago, and they asked me what one of the fastest ways to control blood pressure is as you get older. And the answer was surprising to me when they told me it was gratitude. When they said, and I had often thought the fastest way to change a culture to be more positive was to go thank someone, right? But this idea that it controls our physiology, you've been ahead of the rest of us by a long shot, a step ahead of thinking about how our biology affects so much of the way we live and lead. And gratitude's a big step, isn't it?
Absolutely. Gratitude is key. It literally changes neural pathways in the brain. And so, especially at a time like this, gratitude is one of the greatest antidotes to fear and anxiety. And that's where multitasking is okay if you're not doing 2 cognitive things, like we call it habit stacking. Remember 3 things you're grateful for while you're washing your hands or brushing your teeth or doing regular tasks that don't require your brain. And it's game changing to see, what a difference it makes.
You can almost just feel it, can't you? When you go thank someone. I remember at a charity we had a gratitude night where the only thing people could do was bring somebody they hadn't thanked enough to dinner, and then stand and tell them why they brought them to dinner and how much they thanked them. And we would talk to them a year later, and the person who did the thanking, it changed their lives. It was crazy how much it affected people.
It's amazing. And again, that's a micro step. But it's an incredibly significant one. This concept of micro steps makes me so optimistic, Gary, despite all the problems we're facing. If people can realize that they can change their behaviors, create new habits, which changes our lives, if they realize that they can do it through micro steps, I think we'll see some huge changes. Right now, the the main technique for change is supposed to be the New Year resolutions. I'm going to go to the gym 1 hour a day, and then after 2 or 3 weeks, they're abandoned, and people have a sense of failure, which makes it harder to start.
It's so true about everything. It's like the billions we spend on leadership training in the country that have yielded very little effect over the last 20 years. People go away for a weekend, they come back, and they are like a born-again manager. They shake everybody's hand that moves for a week, and everybody's going like, I wish she'd go back, or I wish he'd go back to normal, right? And eventually they do.
Very quickly. But what is interesting here is that an alternative way, which is to give people tools they can use every day, makes such a difference. We launched, for example, our behavior change product with daily 10-minute webinars with the HR, the entire HR team at Walmart, 2,500 people. The difference is extraordinary because they're using something every day. They're discussing the microsteps they're taking. They're discussing the difference it's making. They may be writing about it and then seeing their colleagues' experiences in the app the next day. And that is, in the end, much more sustainably productive than a great retreat that you come back from, and like a great diet, doesn't bring sustainable change.
Can we do the same thing with curiosity? The
Absolutely.
idea that learning and curiosity, can we do the same thing with Microsteps?
Yes, totally. And we can also have curiosity microsteps. You can apply microsteps to everything. And remember, they are too small to fail.
That's great. All right, a couple quick questions for you. I know our time's getting short. What are you reading, Arianna?
So I am reading a lot of ancient wisdom. I find it extraordinary that whatever tradition you go to, whether it's the Stoic philosophers or the Bhagavad Gita in India or the Tao in China or Zen in Japan, it all comes down to the same principle, that we all have a place of connection, wisdom, strength, peace in us. Most of the time we are all disconnected from it, but it's not difficult to connect to it because it's there. And I feel when we recognize that, it changes everything. So I love going back to some things I've read before or picking up new books. I have like a pile on my nightstand and going in, and I love underlining. I love reading physical books. I haven't broken that habit. And I'm also reading a great book right now that just came out on Tuesday by Bruce Feiler called Life is in the Transitions. He tells the stories of many people across America and how they transform their lives during a transition. It could be an involuntary transition, like having a terrible accident or getting divorced. And now, as Bruce says, we're in the middle of an involuntary and collective transition called a pandemic. So this time is also an incredible opportunity to reflect, to look back, to see at what we want to change. So I feel even though the book is not linked to the pandemic, it is linked to the pandemic because of its deep message.
Wow. And 2 leaders, living or dead, you most admire or most influenced your thinking?
Well, I already mentioned one, Marcus Aurelius. I can't have a leadership list without him. And the other one actually for me will always be Lincoln, because the fact that he took on a challenge, an injustice that seemed like part of the very fabric of the country, and was willing to risk everything, is just to me ultimately what makes a great leader a great leader.
So if a Gen Z leader, a millennial leader, which you have a lot in your company, I'm sure, comes up to you and says, Arianna, I need just one piece of advice, just one to limit my trails, just one piece of advice, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to take more risks and not to let their fears get in the way of their decisions and the risks they take. Because I feel one of the best pieces of advice I got was from my mother, who taught me, as she would put it, that failure is not the opposite of success, it's a stepping stone to success. And I like to talk a lot about my failures along the way because I feel it encourages the Gen Zers to recognize that, that our careers, like our lives, are not linear. And
Wow.
there are a lot of things that go wrong, and they're often the very things that need to go wrong for other things to go right. So it takes a lot of the pressure and the fear and the anxiety out of people's planning around their careers.
Arianna, I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough for taking the time, for your wisdom, for leading us. You've been a visionary and ahead of most of us, most of your life, and you're challenging all of us to think differently. I thank you for doing that and taking the time. And I thank the Washington Speakers Bureau for making this conversation possible and for their commitment to having thought leaders like Arianna come forward and help us figure how we might create cultures in the future that are not only more effective and more human, but in which we can thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. I loved our conversation. Thank you.